So why don't we just talk about this issue? So you talk about groups generating controversy, right? So it's like we do these sorts of controversial kinds of protests. And we talked about one of the benefits, which is that it creates this sense of I'm an activist. It creates this sort of sense of who I am that I can then identify with, and that maybe it'll make me do more activism in the future. In like your experience as like a sociologist studying this stuff, what are the other effects of those kinds of disruptive protests?
Draws attention.
Okay.
It draws attention. Disruptive protests are more likely to draw media attention. And oftentimes that attention isn't great. Oftentimes the media coverage will focus on the activity instead of the issues. But I'm not sure that's always the case. I did some research on PETA and
Okay.
looked at how graphic imagery, I remember when I was working with Stop Huntington Animal Sciences, we used to watch the news right after we'd do an action, and we would quite actually track how many times they showed pictures inside the lab. And when they did that, it was like success. They showed a picture, and so that use of graphic imagery is really important to activists. And what I found in this paper was that groups that are controversial, that have a reputation for being controversial, like PETA, are more likely to get graphic imagery covered by media. So it's like in the immediate sense, disruptive protest just garners attention. And I think in the long-term sense, it can establish an organizational identity that can that exerts a certain amount of a type of leverage used in some ways. Identity.
Fascinating. Okay, so we have like sense of identity, we have getting media attention. There's something else I hear activists talk a lot about, and I'd love to know, to sort of get your sense on this. They'll sort of frame it in either Martin Luther King speech or like Gandhi's, his framework, or like Gene Sharp's framework, where it's like we're actually going to disrupt a system of oppression and coerce it to change. Do you see any of, like, I guess how plausible is that for forms of nonviolent direct action in particularly the animal rights field?
I mean, it depends on the target, and it depends on. So if you have a relatively small target like a business, a smaller business, if the immediate goal is to just get the business to make some kind of concession, then things like disruptive protest, if it's longstanding, if it's consistent, can have that kind of effect. For something that's larger, it's harder. It's harder to use disruptive protest to get larger institutions to change. In those cases, it would appear that it kind of takes both tactics from the ground up, using forms of disruptive and non-disruptive protest to galvanize people from the ground up. Then also some forms of changes to the political context, things like laws and policy reform, to kind of create this like squeezing effect on larger institutions. So I think with disruptive protest, it really does depend on the target and the goal. And if the target is smaller, and if the goal is more feasible, smaller, then disruption can have that kind of impact.
Okay, cool, fascinating. And just to like, maybe I'll just press on this issue one more, and then we'll move on to some other other things.